So, in my relatively recent video on the Hayden class, I talked about escorts in the 24th century and how escorts are not nearly well represented enough in Star Trek, and indeed it seems to be backed up by actual naval historians who I've spoken to, and so Hayden was one such example of escorts that I could see emerging in the post-war Starfleet. However, escorts are not merely the purview of the 24th century. While it is quite clear how escorts are important in the 24th century, what with the runabout revolution and the appearance of the attack ship, the need for escorts in the 24th century is very apparent, but by no means is it exclusive to the 24th century. And that brings us to today's topic, the Archer class. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today, yes, I'm going to be taking a look at the Archer class, a truly small ship. I talked recently about scale in science fiction and how ships that we think are small are in fact actually still quite large. But if there is a contender for a small starship, then it is certainly going to be the Archer class. It's about as small as you can pretty much get, and even then, it's still quite a large ship. You would certainly notice it if it parked outside, that's for sure. So, we're going to be talking about the Archer class because primarily, it's a good way of sort of introducing escorts in the 23rd century. We'll go on to cover other classes like the Okinawa and the Remora, but this is actually quite a good starting place to really look at escorts in the 23rd century and really the beginning of escorts in the culture and history of Starfleet. So without any further ado, I suppose we should just get right into it. So, of course, before we can actually take a look at what is the Archer class, we need to ask, why is Archer? Once again, we're going to go back to the 4 Years' War. During this time period, Starfleet had quite a top-heavy force. This will sound quite familiar. Lots and lots of cruisers, very little in the way of smaller ships. And this put it in a very bad position against the Klingon fleet, who had a good variety of ships. They had a good mix of proper line cruisers that were still generally smaller and lighter than their Starfleet counterparts. The heaviest thing that was generally being brought to battle was going to be the D6, which is still a smaller, more lightly protected ship than, say, a Korolev class. However, the Klingons had so many of these ships and paired them up with other lighter units that they became far more effective. So on the attack, you'd be facing down a lot of D6s and D24s, their main battle cruisers, though of course that's more of a different term. When I say battle cruiser, I mean ship of battle, ship of the line, main battle tank sort of meaning. That's, I think, how we should interpret the word Klingon battle cruiser, rather than it being a lightened battleship. As well as other things like the L5 Swan, which was a very fast and manoeuvrable with 2 very large disruptor cannons. These ships were particularly effective on the attack. They had what we would call strategic mobility. They had the ability to maneuver and change their strategic position relatively quickly. So they were able to often react to a changing and dynamic battle space far quicker than the Starfleet ships of the time that often found themselves flying to battles that had either already been and gone, or just battles that had never happened because the Klingons had gone elsewhere. Now, on the defensive, the Klingons had the advantage of a lot of small escort-type craft that were very good at ambush attacks, the biggest of which would be the Katunko gunship, the D-14s and D-16s, and all of your 22nd century vintage, all of which are quite heavily gunned vessels, even by the standards of the 4 Years' War. So what you would often find is that these would be hiding behind moons, asteroids, in gas giants, and they would either wait for the initial vanguard to go by and then start harassing the supply lines, and of course that will derail any kind of offensive that you have going, or they would just wait for the big ships to basically pass close enough, pop out at great speed, fire their very big guns, and destroy them before they even had a chance to return fire. If those bigger Starfleet ships were able to return fire, they would surely be dead, but because they had such overwhelming initial firepower, they often never had to receive a retaliation. So you're going to say, well, Venom, okay, with all these threats for Starfleet, how did Starfleet win the 4 Years' War? Well, that's a long story. Obviously, the Constitution is a part of that story, but we're not going to talk about the Constitution. We're going to be talking about how Starfleet survived the early half of the 4 Years' War, and the way they survived was the Geronimo class. Now, I've talked previously about the Geronimo class in a couple videos. What can I say? I'm a sucker for double engineering hulled big ships of the 23rd century. Obviously, goes along with the Proxima. So what then is the purpose of the Geronimo class? Well, the Geronimo class isn't a warship by any means. Now, it's very well capable of defending itself. It's powered by 2 full warp reactors, so there's a lot of energy running through this ship, and if it puts that energy into its phasers, my goodness, that's going to hurt. But the problem being is that the Geronimo actually has very limited firing arcs, and it's not a very maneuverable ship. So you're going to ask, well, okay, how did this ship prevail against more maneuverable, more agile Klingon vessels? And the answer is because of its carrying capacity. The Geronimo class carried a lot of auxiliary craft. A lot. And a very common tactic that was pretty quickly developed by Geronimo captains and fleet commanders overall was to deploy the shuttle pods of the Geronimo class as a long-range picket. Really put them out there. And this would provide 2 things. Your picket shuttles could actually provide some early warning. You could potentially see Klingon ships coming from a long way off, or better identify them and keep track of their movements. Most importantly, these allowed you to peek corners, so to speak. So that asteroid field, that gas cloud, that comet, those planetary rings, you can go and you can look through them with these shuttlecraft without risking your larger ships falling victim to an ambush. They served as very valuable reconnaissance assets, and so the Geronimo class became an essential component to the fleets that had them. And certainly, if you didn't have a Geronimo class, you weren't going to last long at all, because you were just going to get outmaneuvered and overrun. So the Geronimo class was very important in fleets surviving the 4 Years' War, while then other more famous ship classes that would follow would ultimately turn the tide. But the Geronimo class was what kept Starfleet alive. But of course, going forward, it's not really practical to expect Starfleet to rely on a outdated carrier concept for its reconnaissance. For one, there are an awful lot of limitations to its capabilities. The shuttlecraft of this time period are not warp capable, and so it's going to be rather lacking in terms of actual, real, long-range reconnaissance. It's good for peeking corners, but it's certainly not going to be able to fully take over the job of destroyers and frigates that would take on reconnaissance roles. So there was that. And also your reconnaissance capabilities are all localized and contingent on this carrier. If they take out the Geronimo, or they take out a similar platform, then you're blind and you don't know what's going on. So it's a lot of eggs in one basket. So Starfleet decides to issue a set of requirements for a small, fast recon asset that is always going to run and never fight. This is not a fight or flight, it's a flight. It's just going to run. And it's going to run fast. Warp 9.4 on the old scale. So it's going to be just as fast as the bigger starships. It's going to have a small crew who are going to go out on high-risk operations. It has to be hard to detect and hard to chase and capable of planetary landing. This gives us 2 capabilities. It means that it's capable of hiding. It also means that it's capable of doing some level of force recon, say for landing parties or other special operations, sabotage and the like. What we get out of this requirement eventually is the Archer class, 45 meters long, 23 meters wide, with a draft of 9 meters. In size, if you want to compare it to another science fiction, it's about the size of a Millennium Falcon. It has 2 decks, just. Essentially, it's one main deck with another additional deck up top, which is basically a combination of engineering and your torpedo/probe launch bay. It's a probe launch bay. It's not meant to fire torpedoes. It's a single tube. You're not going to do anything. It has a crew of 14, and in some sources is stated to have hot bunking. I'm not sure that this would actually be the case. I think whoever wrote that has not seen a naval mess, because of course in crew messes, anyone who's served or anyone who's been on a warship will know bunk beds are not double bunks, they're triple bunks. You have one person basically sleeping on the floor, one person that's about amidships, and one person who's very high. I suspect that the person who is amidships is the top dog, because that's easily the best out of all three, since you don't have to jump down or roll onto the floor to get out of bed. So with that in mind, it's a small adjustment, but you can absolutely get 2 private cabins, one for the commanding officer and one for the second in command, and then 4 sets of 3 tall bunks, which means that everyone will actually have their own bunk. There won't be a need for hot bunking, and that's good because that will increase the longevity of this ship. You don't want to honk bunk if you don't have to, and in this case, they don't have to. So in terms of crew amenities, it has a sick bay, a mess, a heads and showers. It's a fully equipped ship for people to live on for actually quite extended periods of time. In terms of actual operating areas, in terms of actual work areas, it seems to be relatively limited. There seems to be a flight deck, which is your standard bridge setup. Looks like about 5 to 7 people on there at most. An engine room, which at most is going to include 3 people. It's very small. That's what takes up most of the upper deck. So it's a bit of a question as to what the rest of the crew do. I suspect that most of the time the ship is operating on 4 shifts of 3, 2 people on the flight deck, 1 engineer. However, there does seem to be a question as to what everyone is doing when they actually go to action stations. Now, there are other locations on board the ship. I think there's a computer core. Some versions of the ship include a transporter room. I do not think that is necessary. There are spaces there that would presumably serve as a photo reconnaissance center, or, a sensor processing lab. Something where you would actually go and process your sensor telemetry to develop, photos, I suppose. It's 1960s. But, develop your intelligence and analyze your telemetry. And so ultimately, this ship is really centered on one feature, and that is its massive, proportionally, sensor dish. That is not the navigational deflector. I've got a video on that coming out soon. But that is not the navigational deflector. That is a sensor dish. And so that's quite a large sensor dish for a relatively small ship, which means that it can detect out to long distances and can also identify things, again, out to a good range as well. So it's a very important part of the ship. It is the most important part of this ship. This ship is basically a flying nose. So that brings us to the service life of the Archer class. Well, as I said previously, it was kind of a child of the 4 Years' War. It was actually designed during the 4 Years' War. It was intended to be part of the final offensives that the Constitution would lead. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, because while the Archer was conceived alongside the Constitution as part of this new agile fleet doctrine, ultimately it proved far more complicated in its development. It was initially actually intended to be quite a quick development, because it was going to be based off of the Paris class, which was a larger, shorter range vessel, basically a defense monitor. It was a very powerful ship, kind of related to the Texas class, and ultimately the idea was to take that platform and downsize it for the Archer class. Unfortunately, that proved a lot more difficult than it initially seemed. The flight profile of the Paris was ideal, but actually making everything work in that shape at a smaller size was quite challenging. Not to mention that, of course, the smaller your ship is, the tighter the constraints you have. It's a bit like when you're building a battleship in Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, or a battle mech in MechWarrior. If you're building a battleship or an assault mech, you can kind of afford to, throw a few tons there and a few tons there. You got a bit more wiggle room and tolerances. You're building a light mech or a destroyer, you're going to very quickly run into hard limitations on what you can do. So building small ships is often actually a lot harder than building large ships, because you've just got less wiggle room. So that's one problem. It was just the, reality of constructing a very small ship. But then the other problem was that the engine itself was hard to miniaturize. In simulations and in some unmanned tests, it had a distressing tendency to explode, which wasn't great. So unfortunately, the Archer would not be launched till after the 4 Years' War. It then spent a long time in testing and shakedown because it was a novel concept. There had never been a ship like the Archer before. I think its closest relative would be the Freedom class of the 22nd century, which is a very distant relation, and yeah, that goes to show there's a big gap there where they weren't developing small craft. This is the first small escort that Starfleet has developed in a very long time. Ultimately, it wasn't commissioned until much, much later, about 2259. And so its first set of sisters would be launched in the 2260s. Of course, because it is a small ship, actually once it was approved and once it was commissioned into Starfleet, they could build them quite quickly. So it didn't take long before the USS Archer was joined by many, many, many sister ships. There are at least 11 named ships known, but there are likely many more than that. So, then going to its actual service with Starfleet, at least 3 squadrons, that would be a total of 12 ships, were deployed to the Klingon frontier. Additional squadrons would also be deployed to the neutral zone, as well as the Gorn and Tholian frontiers. The advantage that the Archer had, because of its capability for planetary landing, was that it was easy to operate from relatively limited facilities. While, of course, as such a small ship does not necessarily have the duration of a larger starship, like the Constitution, once it's there, it's very easy to operate. It doesn't need a massive starbase facility. As long as it can top up its fuel, it's pretty good to go, and you can always just land on a planet to do most of your maintenance concerns. So it's a very easy ship to maintain out on the frontiers, which is important because that is its mission. It is Starfleet's eyes and ears. It is the first on the scene. And so it needs to be able to survive relatively rugged and hostile environments. Now, some sources say that it would be led by a lieutenant commander. I don't believe that. I think that for a crew of 14, a lieutenant commander is grossly excessive. I think that this would be operated by a full lieutenant, with the executive officer either being a lieutenant junior grade or even an ensign. This is a ship that you are specifically giving to your hotshot officers. This is your fast track to promotion and command. This is how you find out if these people who have perhaps really impressed at the academy, this is where you see if they can bring home the bacon. And so, yes, the Archer class attracted a lot of ambitious young hotshots, and this in turn fed into the culture, the aura, the glamour of the Archer class. You see, this small, fast ship of Starfleet, it was the first on the scene. It was the first into the danger zone. Their crews took risks. They were, daring and audacious. So the Archer crews themselves acquired something of a romantic status. They were true adventurers and risk takers and mavericks. And the ships themselves drew a lot of attention. It was pioneering technology for the time, and it was critically very easy to show off to civilians. You could actually bring an Archer class to a planet and land it and have people walk around it. And that meant that it enjoyed a far greater profile than, say, other larger starships of the time, which of course can't land on planets. So that meant that the public got up close and personal with the Archer class, and so it left an indelible impression on them. And of course, as I say before, because of what the Archer did, it has an innate romance to it. You know, it's a small crew of highly trained individuals operating in, you know, very close quarters to each other. It's brilliant for writing smut if you want to do that. It was a very easy to tell story for Starfleet. It's something where you could publish stories about the adventures of this Archer crew, and, you know, people would be able to keep track of who was who and all those kinds of things. It was a much more personal ship than, say, a big starship, which is almost 400 people. Most of us do not have 400 people that we know properly. We know at most 100 people, and I would say of that, people who we would actually term friends, probably not even half that. So there's something to be said for this smaller crew being a more appealing concept. Unfortunately, the only thing that moves faster than the Archer is time itself. By the 2270s, the Archer class is becoming outmoded. The Klingons are deploying newer, faster ships like the L3, which is a very, very fast, very scary ship. Well, if you're an Archer, it's a scary ship. And the platform itself is hard to upgrade. Again, wiggle room. When you're upgrading and refitting something like a Constitution, you've got your wiggle room. When you're trying to do a similar refit on a small platform, it's kind of hard to do that without, again, breaking your limitations. But a few would be refitted and continue service into the 2270s and 80s, but they would soon disappear by the 80s because the 2280s saw new threats emerging. We have now the ubiquity of cloaking technology. We have the introduction of the Klingon Burrell-class bird of prey, which means that being able to run is not always enough because you can't run from what you can't see. And unfortunately, the hazards of going behind enemy lines, the whole romance of, going on missions deep behind Klingon lines, by the 2280s, this is a fantasy. You're not doing it. There's birds of prey hiding who knows where, and there's also detection grids all over the place, and detection grids are especially good at picking up fast-moving ships, because when you are at warp, the faster you are moving, the bigger your return signature is. So moving fast is no longer enough. So unfortunately, the Archer class would soon be replaced by ships like the Okinawa and Remora class, but that is a story for another time. So, just to round things up, the Archer represents a then novel concept, a small, fast ship capable of actually travelling a decent distance. It also demonstrates Starfleet's moving towards this idea of specialization, the idea that not every problem can be solved by the application of a general purpose cruiser platform, that sometimes you need to specialize, and ultimately a recognition that information is ammunition, and it's all very well and good having, these big, mighty heavy cruisers that they had in the 4 Years' War, but it's no bloody good if they don't know where to go. So while the Archer class is by no means the best armed ship of the time, ultimately it's a demonstration that speed and power solve many problems. And, comparing it to Defiant, people often talk about Defiant being Cisco's pimp hand and what happens when Starfleet gets nuts, but I think nuts doesn't always have to be big guns. Sometimes, let me ask you something. Who do you think has the bigger balls? The crew that rides into battle on the Defiant, or the crew that dives behind Klingon lines in an Archer class? Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Yes, hopefully I'll be covering more escorts. Leave your suggestions for what other 23rd century escorts I should be covering in the comments below. And once again, I shall see you all in the next video. Before we go, I'd like to give credit to Owen E. Alton of coldnorth.com. He is the one who created the Archer class cutaways. And I'd also like to credit Rob Caswell, whose art you may have been seeing throughout the video. But you may recognize some of his art from the Star Trek Vanguard book series, and both their links are in the description go check them out. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarks, Tully DT, Zaylan Maru, Midwest Safety, and Lady Altair. My ever-dutiful commanders, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Sean Farrell, David Reeves, Rella, Gabe Logan, Adam Bowman, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Tin Alt, John Radek, and NC98. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oko Catman Questo, John Nicole, Athena, Tobias Klein, Bird of Play D3, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, the shakiest gun in the Ozarks, Shipmaster, Valetra Petra Siren, Japhany Hughes, Ian Hans, Rogel Dom, Stephen Ross, Tom Mosley, Capt Hellish, and John C. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants, and I welcome Pixelated Rabbit, and I welcome James Morgan, Joe Wilhelm, Grim Reaper, Pixelated Rabbit, Tucker from What Blitz, Datsmalo Wolfar, Sean Gacone, Golden Sketch, Samuel Lewis, Jay Chun, and Federation HQ. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.